This video was brought to you by Brilliant. On Wednesday, the IMF released Chapter 4 of its World Economic Outlook, where it warned that while no one really wins, China's economy would be worse affected than the US if the two countries were to continue with their so-called decoupling. Now, this comes only a few days after the IMF's director urged China to rebalance its economy towards consumption. Now, it's important not to overstate this. The IMF is still optimistic about China's growth prospects, and it expects China to account for a plurality of growth in the coming years. Nonetheless, these are measured words from an institution that's usually basically unconditionally optimistic about China's economy. So in this video, we're going to take a look at why the IMF is worried about China's low consumption. And don't worry if you have no idea what that means, we'll explain it all in a second. As well as diving into why China's consumption is so low, and how this explains why it'll struggle if they continue decoupling from the US. To understand this video, you're going to need to know a little bit about macroeconomics. Basically, a country's GDP is often defined as the sum of four things: government spending, business investment, household consumption, and the difference between exports and imports. Now, we're not going to go through this in too much detail, but the main thing you need to know is that household consumption only makes up a small fraction of Chinese GDP, with most economists agreeing that consumption accounts for only about a third of China's GDP. Now, a third might sound like quite a lot, but this is actually the lowest of any major economy, and far less than developed economies. In practice, this means that your average Chinese person doesn't really buy or consume all that much stuff. And instead, the Chinese economy is mostly driven by Chinese businesses selling stuff to foreigners. This is notably different from other developed economies, which often do have well-developed export industries, i.e. they sell a lot of stuff abroad, but their citizens also buy a lot of stuff. So why is there this discrepancy? Well, it's actually quite simple. China's rapid export-driven growth over the last few decades has been enabled by laws and regulations which allow Chinese businesses to essentially underpay their workers, which means they have competitive prices, but these workers can't consume much. In fact, labor unions are illegal in China, which means that it's hard for Chinese workers to negotiate higher wages, and people who do try to form unions are usually arrested. China's tax system also focuses on consumption taxes like VAT rather than income taxes, which means that, in practice, poor Chinese people pay disproportionately more tax than richer people do. These taxes are then often used to subsidize state-owned enterprises, making their exports even more competitive, instead of being spent locally on public services. And in practice, this is just another way to underpay workers. The workers get less money, while the businesses get more money and sell more exports. The CCP also disadvantages workers in more subtle ways. China's hukou system, for example, basically denies non-residents access to certain benefits, and therefore enables Chinese companies to underpay migrant workers from other parts of China. Chinese companies also regularly use cheap student labor. In 2017, for example, 3,000 high school students were sent on a compulsory work experience trip to Apple's Foxconn factory. And worse still, there's obviously the forced labor camps still going on in Xinjiang. Ultimately, this is one of the reasons why, despite being a nominally communist system, China has some of the worst inequality anywhere in the world. The CCP also deliberately undervalues the yuan, which makes exports even more competitive and makes foreign goods even more expensive for ordinary Chinese workers. You get the idea then. Chinese businesses don't have to pay their workers very much, and this is part of the reason why China exports so much stuff. Not only does this allow Chinese businesses to produce stuff very cheaply, which creates more demand for their exports abroad, But because Chinese workers don't have much purchasing power, Chinese companies couldn't sell to their domestic market even if they wanted to, so they have to sell it abroad. Now, at this point in the video, you might be wondering why this is a bad thing. Well, in many ways, it's not. Obviously, China's export-driven model has been in many ways a phenomenal success. China has experienced rapid GDP growth, even if it has been somewhat overstated. And as such, they've been able to lift 800 million people out of poverty. Its enormous trade surplus has also given China immense geopolitical power, because many countries are now dependent on China for critical commodities and parts. China also dominates in the production and processing of rare earth elements and other metals critical for the coming energy transition. In fact, according to the latest IEA report, China alone accounts for the production of 90% of all rare earth elements, which are used in most high-end technology, 80% of all polysilicon, which is used in solar panels, and about 60% of all lithium, copper, nickel, and cobalt, all of which are used in batteries. However, this export-driven economy isn't an unequivocally good thing, and there are at least two disadvantages to China's current economic model. Firstly, this model is partly responsible for China's enormous debt burden. That's because Beijing demands that local governments meet certain GDP targets each and every year. And if you can't increase GDP by consumption, you have to increase it by investment, which is just any money spent on some sort of infrastructure that aims to increase economic productivity. However, not all investments actually increase productivity, or at least don't sufficiently increase productivity to justify their upfront costs. For example, imagine London, but with all of the bridges removed. The first bridge would be a great investment, allowing North and South to trade with each other for the first time. The second bridge would likely also be a good investment, given that the first bridge would probably be chock-a-block full of traffic. Now, given that there are currently 35 bridges in London, and traffic on them is still pretty bad, the next 33 bridges would likely also be good investments. But at a certain point, the bridges would just become non-productive investments. Just imagine the limit case where there's a bridge every couple of meters. Each new bridge would cost millions of pounds, but add nothing to net economic activity. And this is, to some extent, what happens in China. Local governments borrow loads of money to build enormous infrastructure projects, like high-speed trains, which technically increase GDP, but because Chinese households aren't all that economically active, i.e. don't have enough money to justify these investments, China's local government debt just keeps piling up, which is one of the things the IMF are most anxious about. Secondly, the export-driven economic model leaves China uniquely vulnerable in a trade war, because China's GDP relies on exports to countries like America. And if America starts decoupling from China, Chinese households won't have enough purchasing power to make up the shortfall, which is why the IMF thinks that China's economy would be worse affected in this outcome. Now, again, it's worth remembering that the headline of the IMF report is that no one wins from decoupling, and it would be terrible for the global economy more generally. But the point we're making is that China's unbalanced growth model makes things even more difficult for the CCP. Ultimately then, while this report from the IMF might be difficult reading around the world, China probably has the most to lose, and it'll be interesting to see if their strategy changes at all in response to it, as this trade war continues over the next weeks, days, and even minutes. But while we're waiting, it only takes a few minutes every day to massively improve your skills and safeguard your career against artificial intelligence. That's by investing in your own human intelligence. And that's where Brilliant.org comes in. Brilliant.org is the best way to learn maths and computer science in a fun and interactive way. Brilliant has thousands of lessons from foundational and advanced maths to AI, data science, neural networks, decision-making, and more, with new lessons added monthly. That logical decision-making course is super interesting too, using principles from maths and science to help you reach your own decisions. And I'm not naming any names, but perhaps some politicians ought to get a Brilliant account. Anyway, you can try everything that Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days by clicking our link in the description. Plus, the first 200 TLDR viewers to do that will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thanks for your support, and thanks for watching TLDR.